Hello everybody, what is up? Cobra here with a modification video for Global War 2025. Now, this is more of an expansion video that I'm just calling the Neutrals modification for Global War 2025. And you may be saying to yourself, how have I already made an expansion for this game? But it is not something that's too big, and I've just always been a fan of neutrals and representing the different countries across the world. To a greater extent, with Global War and also my 1914 game. So I thought to basically do this for this game, and there really isn't a lot of neutrals. I think there's like 10 or so in this game. There might be less than that, like 7. But one thing was that some of the nations kind of just felt a little empty, or another way to put it is just undiverse of units. And so one part of that can definitely be explained by gameplay. You need places to be balanced, of course. And then the other reason is just because of the scale of 2025. Now, from what I've kind of deduced, of course, with most Axis and Allies games, scale is definitely, it goes up and down. Africa could have more infantry represented by one infantry piece, whereas in America, it's representing, like 1,000,000 men or something like that. So scale is definitely a thing, but especially in this game, because it's a smaller game with less pieces, those pieces have to represent more units. So something like, one thing I've definitely found is that with MBTs, the main battle tanks that you get in this game, they represent around 1,000 tanks in real life. And so with those kind of numbers, you're not going to be able to set up neutrals with, say, like, 2 tanks, even if they have the armored capacity. So, like, for instance, we have Indonesia here, which is a big one, because not only does it have the most territories of all the neutrals in the game, but it's also, in real life, a decently militarized nation. It has a good economy, and it can fund its military, so it has a diverse range of units, such as aircraft, tanks, and naval units in real life. But in this game, you can't really, throw in, say, a submarine, because while Indonesia has submarines, they only have about 4, and you can't really represent or justify that being a whole unit in this game, when a submarine usually represents about 20 in real life. And then same with, like, aircraft. Indonesia, I think, or most neutrals in real life, don't have a ton of weapon systems, because they're just so expensive nowadays. A nation buying 100 aircraft nowadays, next generation fighter jets, is a lot different than a nation buying a couple of propeller Mustangs, in the 1950s. And I guess nations could do that nowadays, but the effectiveness of something like that going up against any sort of foreign invader using next generation fighter jets is just not going to go well for the less technologically adept nation. So that was one thing I had to contend with. So I was going through all these different sites, kind of categorizing different armies and everything, and I've come across a kind of what I deemed balanced setup that I like, and it adds a little bit more diversity to the game and representation. So the least changed area, I would say, is Asia. As you can see here, Indonesia, for some of you people that have played the game or at least looked at the rules and stuff, Indonesia, the Philippines haven't really seen any changes. And that, again, just goes down to the numbers of units that they have in real life and how it stacks up in the game. Now, what I've made for you guys, if you guys want to play this expansion and kind of get more into it, I have made a pretty nice looking formatted basically setup chart for these pieces. So I guess I'll go through these, read them off to you guys, and you can follow along. And if you want to print it off, you can go down to the description and print off this copy so you can use this new setup and add a little bit more fun to the game. So I guess we'll start with Indonesia. So I've written little descriptions of this futuristic scenario. And so Indonesia, always balancing diplomacy, Jakarta has done well establishing close ties with world powers, but increasing nationalism and militarism has strained relations with Southeast Asia. Since the invasion of Papua New Guinea and the recent annexation of East Malaysia, the Indonesian government has wrote a fine line between belligerence and neutrality. And that basically addresses the fact that all of New Guinea is belonging to Indonesia now, and there's no East Malaysia, and of course, too, Malaysia has been incorporated into China. So the background behind this is that the Chinese invaded Malaysia maybe a year or a couple months before this war breaks out, and the Indonesians seize the opportunity by just, quote unquote, protecting the East Malaysians by incorporating that into their nation. And of course, I haven't changed their setup at all because this is their kind of a decently balanced setup that I like for them, that I didn't have to change. Next up is the Philippines. So, torn between its longtime American allies and Western neighbors, China, the Philippines attempts to solidify historic divisions between its population. With one of the most under-equipped armies on Earth, neutrality appears advantageous for the coming conflict. Now, with the Philippines, the original setup calls for 2 infantry. Now, I had originally wanted to make this 1, considering the weakness of numbers and equipment of the Filipino army, but I decided to keep it at 2 infantry, mainly because it just helps balance it a little bit. I feel like 1 infantry would just be a little too easy for the Chinese to, say, send like an airborne and a helicopter to just take it real quick for some extra IPCs and a naval and air base. So the 2 infantry have stayed behind to help defend the Philippines. Next up is the kind of oddball of the neutrals, the Solomon Islands. With no standing army to speak of and lack of infrastructure and funds to field any sort of defense, many of the island nations of Micronesia rely heavily on the protection of the Pacific Coalition to defend their vast maritime borders. And I kind of lumped the Solomon Islands into kind of all of Micronesia, which are all the South Pacific islands down here, and kind of taking inspiration from these Pacific Coalition ships that seem out of place patrolling out in the middle of the Pacific, but I kind of lump them into maybe some Australian warships or Japanese warships that have been sent out to kind of secure these South Pacific seas. And the Solomons and most of these islands really don't have any sort of army except for some kind of police force, and that's mainly because they don't have the population to deal with any sort of invasion. If an invasion came, there really wouldn't be too much they could do, so they rely on ties with Australia, America, and Japan, of course. And then lastly, for the Asiatic theater, and the first change you'll be seeing, if I can get the camera to go onto there, is Mongolia. So, Mongolia, the story behind this sandwiched nation. Constantly balancing neutrality between its sandwiched neighbors, the Mongolian government will likely cave to the Eastern Pact demands for war, rather than take its chances with making ties with far-off Western alliances. And that basically signifies that Mongolia will probably, at some point in the game, either stay neutral or end up being annexed by the Chinese or Russians, diplomatically, of course, although it could be invaded. And so Mongolia does start with 2 infantry, but now we have replaced one of those infantry with an MBT, and you can see I've got a cool little BT-76 painted up for that, and that represents the almost 1,000 armored vehicles that Mongolia still has in their arsenal that came from the Soviet backing back in the day. And a lot of these a lot of the nations of the former Soviet republics, and Mongolia, who is a close ally, still maintains a lot of those units. So I've added that, and I like that addition because, still 2 units, 2 hits if somebody wants to invade them, but it gives them a bit more diversity. You get Mongolia, you get a dollar, and you get that MBT, which is a pretty nice little unit to get. Alright, moving on across the map, we have Africa, or the multiple African states. And Africa is quite a big continent, and I'll leave out Madagascar. So, going to Africa, the setup stays pretty much the same as the original game. In 2023, the leaders of Africa convened in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of the Congo, to hold the largest Pan-African peace summit ever. With war between the superpowers on the horizon, millions in Africa hope their allied nations can escape the bloodshed. But with the caliphate gains in East Africa, many choose sides to determine the future of the African continent. And as you can see, Africa has 3 territories. Like I said, no setup changes. I thought that they did a pretty good job just, with the 2 infantry in most territories. Madagascar, in my opinion, didn't have enough military in real life to symbolize 1 infantry, but of course, it's more of a balance thing. You don't want somebody just airborning in or dropping off an infantry just to take that money. And it gives you, something to go for, with not only a buck, but an infantry that you get out of aligning it. Alright, and then lastly, in my favorite additions to the game, are in South America. Let's see if we can get all the South American nations in here. And I don't have my custom Brazilian frigate yet, so we're just going to take one from Indonesia to represent that. And I guess first up, let's start in Mexico and the Caribbean. So, first up, we have Cuba. The dynamic between the US and Cuba has been tense at best over the past 60 years. Fielding the second largest concentration of MBTs in the Western Hemisphere, time will tell if Havana decides to confront the Venezuelan threat in the Caribbean or join the ranks of the Eastern Pact to achieve revenge on their northern rivals. And as you can see here, Cuba now possesses an NBT and an infantry. And I think Cuba was my biggest, disappointment about this game, because I do like that it's neutral, because it basically allows them, Cuba isn't exactly the same as their 1960s counterpart, but, a lot of people were wondering why it wasn't aligned to Russia, but I liked the fact that it was neutral because it allows, the US could align it, the Russians could align it, so and it's right in the middle of the Caribbean, so somebody can get, like, a gain, basically, out of it. But what I didn't like is that, as you can see, there's no IPC value. Now, there's no naval facilities or air bases, but that makes a little bit of sense. It isn't a hugely developed nation. But the fact that there's no IPCs, and then places like the Solomon Islands get an IPC out of it, and not only is that an IPC, but it represents infantry that can be built, I didn't like that fact too much. So in this modification, not only does it get the tank and the infantry, but Cuba is worth an IPC, just one. And that, again, represents not only a little bit of money that you get out of the island, but an ability to build, an infantry per turn if you really wanted to. So, now, this is a pretty balanced setup for Cuba, mainly because since they don't have any facilities for airlift or sea lift, this tank and infantry are pretty much stuck on the island. So for someone like Russia, it could make sense to align Cuba if you have some spare diplomacy going around, because if you do align it, you're getting an extra IPC, and that tank and infantry, while they can't be flown out of there or sailed out of there, they can help to just defend that IPC from the Americans and result in a pretty decent defense, considering that they have a tank to go along with that. And if say the Russians come down here somehow with an LVT, or maybe the Caliphate decides to help out, they could always, remove these vehicles from the island. But I do like this little Cuban setup. One thing that I kind of wished, this would have been a cool idea, is if Cuba maybe was like a bit bigger, had this setup of, an infantry and a tank, and then maybe the other half of Cuba could be Guantanamo Bay, and then, the Cubans would be aligned to the Russians, and they could, maybe do an invasion. That would have been a cool little addition to the game. But, like I said, with this little army that they now have, the IPC that I made them worth, I definitely think that is a nice little addition to the game. Alright, so enough with Cuba. Let's get to Mexico, which hasn't been changed. Focusing on internal conflicts against powerful cartels and corruption, the end of the drug war seems in sight. Mexico maintains one of the most robust and advanced police organizations on Earth. Now, the Mexican public looks to maintain neutrality to consolidate a nation plagued by violence for nearly 100 years. So as you can see, Mexico only has 2 infantry, and on the west coast, they don't possess anything. And basically this near future Mexico represents one that has kind of collectivized, taken down the drug trade, and has solidified as a nation. And they now represent a stable nation that can help support the U.S. or maybe get invaded by the U.S. to help combat that whole Southern Caribbean threat of the Russians and Venezuelans. So, getting back here to the big players of the South American continent, we have, first up, we'll go with the Andes Alliance, which represents Peru here. And now, I am missing one unit, and we will just take this fighter jet. Now, this from the Caliphate, but pretend it's white for now. This is an optional unit, and I'll get into that later. So, the Andes Alliance, and as you can see here, it's just called Peru-Bolivia, but the background is surrounded by powerful neighbors in the ever-growing Venezuelan Empire. The remaining nations of South America seek a coordinated joint defense, with Peru forming the backbone of this ragtag force. The alliance must rely on its manpower and guarantees of superpowers to maintain neutrality. So, as you can see here, they are definitely the weakest of the bunch. They represent just a coalition of the last couple South American nations that kind of seek a joint defense so that the Venezuelans can't just, say invade Ecuador and the rest will just sit behind and watch. Now, this nation, I'm going to see how it plays out in the game right now, because I did want to add a frigate, because between Peru and Ecuador, in my opinion, they constituted enough ships to possess a frigate, but I just thought that, a frigate and then with this optional fighter jet and infantry, it might be a little too strong, but I might throw it in because it just, it adds a little bit more fun to the game. But like I said, maybe not. We'll have to play and see how this setup ends up working out. But their infantry stays the same, and now why I've added an optional fighter jet to their setup is because, in my readings, none of these nations possessed a big enough air force, in my mind, to constitute, or a big enough fighter and ground attack air force to constitute adding a fighter or helicopter. The reason I've added this is because Peru, since the 1950s, has maintained a very well-trained aerial or air force. In the 80s, they got ground attack helicopters like the Russian Hind helicopters. So they definitely have maintained a very professional and well-equipped air force. And in my readings, it was basically the newest government of Peru. The president has basically stated that they want to start purchasing new fighters, and from Russia, and I think the other was from NATO, or the Griffin, or the Gryphon, and the Russian MiG. And basically they wanted to purchase, I think it was 80 of each, and then also start investing in the new Indonesian, Taiwanese, fourth generation fighter jet to maybe get a couple of those. So, in my opinion, what I kind of lead that up to is that in this near future, those kind of go through, and Peru builds up its air force and gets to be one of the strongest in South America, with some new generation fighters and a lot more other secondary fighters. So that is the Andes Alliance. Now getting to, I think, Argentina Chile, we have got arguably one of the most militarily capable of the ABC nations. Argentina and Chile maintain strong military forces. Since 2024, these nations have been militarily bound by the Good Hope Pact to defend their far-off southern states of South America from superpowers such as America and Russia. So they maintained their frigate and one of their infantry from the original setup, but I gave them an MBT, and that represents the combined strength of Argentina and Chile's tank strength. The Chileans possess around about, I think it was 300 MBTs, with the Argentinians having 200. I think it was up there, a little higher than 500 MBTs. So, and again, considering Argentina has been falling behind in terms of their military spending and training ever since the Falklands War, but Chile has maintained a pretty decent martial prowess and maintaining a strong and advanced military with the fact that they have purchased, Leopards and next generation main battle tanks. So, and again, it adds diversity because, you're getting this MBT. America or Russia may decide instead of going for Brazil, they'll go for Chile because they've got this MBT. They could maybe blitz this tank up into Venezuela if they really wanted to. Alright, and then lastly we have Brazil, one of the probably the strongest nation in this game, or neutral nation. Wielding one of the largest nations in South America, Brazil seeks to maintain strong ties with its Portuguese-speaking brethren. With a struggling economy and increasingly belligerent northern neighbor, the ever more desperate Brazilian government seeks to maintain its small but elite paratrooper arm, along with funding its beleaguered navy. So, Brazil has a pretty diverse navy. They have an entire aircraft carrier, actually, or an amphibious landing ship. But of course, just one of those doesn't really constitute a unit in this game, so we've just got a frigate from the original setup. Now, while it looks like only 4 infantry here, it is actually 3 with this guy being an airborne. I just don't have a spare chip for him at the moment. So on land, I like this because, again, keeping with, I didn't want to increase anyone's numbers too much. So with Brazil, they still have 4 hits to take this territory. It's kind of like how I see it, or 4 hits against a attacker if they're defending. But instead of one of their infantry, they get a paratrooper. And this represents the Brazilians' paratrooper arm, which has been, I think it was established back in World War II. And they've seen combat in the Caribbean during the Dominican Civil War. And they've been sent on many peacekeeping missions. And they're pretty well equipped with new transport helicopters and aircraft. And so I like having that airborne there because also Brazil has that air base. So if you align Brazil, then say the Russians align Brazil, well, with that airborne, they could maybe make an attack on Canada or America, just little symbolic attack against them if it's undefended. Or if America gets it, they could maybe launch an attack on the Caliphate. So I like having that little airborne there. And then the last little modification that I made to my game is I've got this little 3D printed Nike missile, and it's supposed to represent a cruise missile, and I like having it there because when you align Brazil in the actual out-of-box setup, you get 2 free cruise missiles representing you seizing their missile supplies or being able to use their missile supplies. So I've represented that on the board. Basically, what I like about setting up neutrals is that you don't have to refer to the neutral chart. You just see what you have here, you take it all off the board and replace it with, Americans or whoever aligns them. But this is a pretty long video now that I look at it, and not a ton changes. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you do, leave a comment below. Maybe comment any other ideas that you would like to see. There definitely isn't a lot that I want to change yet, because as I look at gameplay and kind of play out some turns with this game, I am seeing that, they did so much good with this game. I really like it so far. So, and I've played out a couple little practice rounds, to get some strategy. Hopefully I can get a main game with a bunch of players going by the end of the week. But I hope you guys enjoyed this enough talking, and I want to get to playing with these neutral mods and everything and seeing how they play out. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Look down in the description below for the setups of these neutrals, and I hope to see you guys again. Cobra, out.